A penguin walks into a hospital. Why it came will bring tears to your eyes. The snowstorm howled like a restless ghost outside the windows of St. Mercy Hospital, a sprawling brick building that stood defiantly against the Arctic winds sweeping through the remote Alaskan town. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed softly, casting a sterile glow over the long corridors. Dr. Emily Carter, a seasoned veterinarian on a rare rotation at the hospital's research wing, sat at her desk, her fingers wrapped around a lukewarm cup of coffee. Her brown eyes scanned the reports in front of her, but her mind wandered to the storm raging outside. The relentless winds seemed to echo her inner turmoil, a sense of unease she couldn't quite place. The night was supposed to be uneventful. Most of the hospital staff had gone home early, bracing for the blizzard that was forecasted to last through the weekend. Only a skeleton crew remained, their movements sluggish as the weather's oppressive weight seeped into the building. Emily sighed, pushing the report aside. She leaned back in her chair, letting her gaze drift toward the window. The snow blurred the world into a white void, and for a moment, she felt utterly alone in the vastness of the wilderness. The silence was shattered by the piercing sound of an alarm. Emily jolted upright, her coffee spilling onto the desk. The emergency doors swung open with a metallic groan, and a burst of icy wind swept into the lobby, carrying with it a flurry of snowflakes and the unmistakable scent of the wild. "Who opened the doors?" came a voice from the front desk, panic lacing the tone. Nurse Martha, a stout woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, hurried toward the entrance, her sensible shoes clicking against the tiled floor. Emily grabbed her coat and followed instinctively, her heart pounding. Something about the night felt off. As they reached the lobby, they froze. There, standing amidst the swirling snow, was a penguin. The bird was small, no taller than a toddler, its black and white feathers glistening with melting snowflakes. Its dark eyes darted around the room, wide with what looked like panic, or perhaps desperation. Clutched in its beak was a piece of fabric, tattered and smeared with something that made Emily's stomach tighten: blood. For a moment, no one moved. The absurdity of the scene held them captive. A penguin, here, in the middle of a snowstorm, miles away from any zoo or natural habitat, was not just improbable, it was impossible. The penguin took a shaky step forward, its webbed feet slapping against the cold floor. It let out a sharp, mournful cry, the sound echoing through the silent lobby. The fabric dropped from its beak, revealing what looked like the corner of a child's sweater. "Is that?" Martha began, her voice trembling. Emily didn't wait to hear the rest. She knelt, her veterinarian instincts kicking in as she studied the bird. Its chest heaved with labored breaths, and its feathers were matted with ice. But it wasn't just its physical state that caught her attention, it was the urgency in its eyes, a silent plea that spoke louder than any words could. "Something's wrong," Emily murmured, more to herself than anyone else. "It's trying to tell us something." The penguin let out another cry, louder this time, and began waddling toward the hallway leading deeper into the hospital. It stopped after a few feet, turning back to look at them, as if urging them to follow. Emily hesitated for only a moment before standing. "We need to follow it." "Are you serious?" Martha asked, her face pale. "It's just an animal." "No," Emily interrupted, her tone firm. "It's more than that. Look at it, it came here for a reason. That blood, and the sweater piece. It's trying to lead us to something, or someone." Martha stared at her, then at the penguin, and finally gave a reluctant nod. "Fine. But if this turns out to be some prank?" Emily didn't wait to hear the rest. She grabbed a flashlight from the supply cabinet and motioned for the few staff members who had gathered to stay back. The penguin had already started moving again, its movements growing more frantic. The hallway was eerily quiet, the only sound the muffled wail of the storm outside. Emily's boots squeaked against the floor as she followed the penguin, her mind racing. Where had it come from? Why was it here? And what had happened to the person who owned the sweater? As they reached a side door leading to the hospital's back exit, the penguin stopped and let out a piercing cry, pawing at the base of the door with its flippers. Emily crouched down, shining her flashlight across the threshold. Her breath caught in her throat. There, barely visible in the snowdrift outside, was a trail of blood. It led away from the hospital and into the blizzard, disappearing into the swirling white. "We need to call for help," Emily said, her voice steady despite the fear creeping into her chest. "There's someone out there. And this penguin might be our only chance of finding them in time." The bird turned to her, its dark eyes glinting with determination. For the first time, Emily felt an unspoken connection with the creature, a bond that went beyond logic. This wasn't just a random animal, it was a messenger, a guide. And it wasn't going to stop until its mission was complete. The icy wind bit at Emily's cheeks as she pushed open the side door, the blizzard immediately rushing in with a ferocity that almost knocked her off balance. Snow swirled like a living entity, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. The penguin waddled outside, undeterred by the freezing conditions, its small body pushing through the thick snow with an urgency that couldn't be ignored. Emily followed, clutching her flashlight and pulling her coat tighter. Behind her, Martha hesitated at the threshold, muttering about the madness of the situation but reluctantly stepping out as well. The blood trail was faint but distinct, a series of dark red smears against the pristine white snow. Emily's mind raced with questions. Who was hurt? How had the penguin found its way here? Why did it seem to know exactly where to go? "Emily, this is insane!" Martha shouted over the howling wind. "We don't even know what we're looking for. We're looking for whoever this belongs to." Emily shot back, holding up the torn, bloodied sweater piece. "And this penguin is our guide. If you want to go back, go ahead, but I'm not stopping." The penguin let out a high-pitched cry, its tiny body shivering in the cold as it pressed onward. Emily felt a pang of guilt. The bird was clearly struggling, yet it refused to give up. It was almost as if it understood the stakes, as if it knew that time was running out. They trudged through the snow, their boots crunching against the ice. The trail led them away from the hospital grounds and toward the dense line of trees marking the edge of the forest. Emily's flashlight beam bounced across the terrain, illuminating only endless snowdrifts and the occasional glimpse of the blood trail. Who could possibly be out here in this weather? Martha muttered, her breath visible in the freezing air. Emily didn't respond. Her focus was on the penguin, which had stopped suddenly. It turned its head, letting out another mournful cry before continuing forward, this time more slowly. The blood trail grew thicker, darker, as if whatever had happened was recent. Suddenly, Emily's flashlight caught something in the distance, a dark shape half buried in the snow. Her heart leapt into her throat. "There," she shouted, breaking into a run. The shape became clearer as she approached. It was a figure, small and motionless, lying face down in the snow. Emily dropped to her knees, the cold seeping through her pants as she rolled the figure over gently. It was a child. A boy, no older than 6, his face pale and lips blue from the cold. He was barely dressed for the weather, wearing only a thin jacket and jeans, both soaked through. The sweater piece the penguin had carried must have been his. "Oh my God," Martha whispered, arriving beside her. "Is he?" Emily pressed her fingers to the boy's neck, searching for a pulse. For a moment, panic gripped her, his skin was ice-cold, and she couldn't feel anything. Then, faint and weak, she found it, a slow, fragile rhythm. "He's alive," she exclaimed, relief flooding her voice. "But barely. We need to get him back to the hospital now." As Emily and Martha worked to lift the boy, the penguin let out a sharp cry and waddled a few feet away, looking back at them as if urging them to hurry. Emily couldn't help but glance at the bird with amazement. It had led them straight to the boy, somehow knowing he was here, somehow understanding the urgency. As they carried the boy through the storm, the penguin stayed close, occasionally crying out as if encouraging them to keep moving. The trek back to the hospital felt twice as long, the wind whipping against their faces and the snow deepening with every step. Emily's arms ached from carrying the child, but she refused to slow down. Every second mattered. Finally, the hospital's lights came into view, a warm beacon against the storm's fury. Emily felt a surge of hope as they reached the doors, which slid open with a hiss. The warmth of the lobby enveloped them, a stark contrast to the icy wilderness outside. "Get the trauma room ready," Emily shouted to the startled staff inside. Nurses and doctors sprang into action, rushing to assist as Emily and Martha carried the boy to the nearest stretcher. The penguin followed them inside, its tiny body trembling from exhaustion. Emily glanced back at it as they wheeled the boy into the trauma room. For a moment, their eyes met, and she felt an overwhelming gratitude toward the small creature. Without it, the boy would have been lost forever in the snow. Inside the trauma room, the atmosphere was tense. The medical team worked quickly, cutting away the boy's wet clothes and wrapping him in thermal blankets. Emily stood by, her heart pounding as she watched the monitors. His pulse was weak, and his body temperature was dangerously low, but he was alive. "Do we have any idea who he is?" Martha asked, her voice hushed. Emily shook her head. "No ID, no belongings, nothing. He's just a little boy, out there all alone. It doesn't make any sense." Martha glanced toward the door, where the penguin sat quietly, its head cocked as if listening. "And that bird. It's like it knew exactly what to do." Emily nodded, her gaze softening as she looked at the penguin. "It's not just a bird. It's a hero." As the medical team stabilized the boy, Emily stepped out of the room, exhaustion weighing on her. She crouched beside the penguin, who looked up at her with tired but determined eyes. "You saved his life," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how, but you did." The penguin let out a soft chirp, almost as if acknowledging her words. Emily reached out hesitantly, brushing her fingers against its feathers. They were damp and cold, but beneath them, she could feel the steady rise and fall of its chest. It was alive, resilient, and utterly extraordinary. As she sat there, stroking the penguin's back, a question lingered in her mind, a question that refused to be silenced. Where had the boy come from? And why had the penguin risked everything to bring him here? The answers, she knew, would not come easily. But one thing was certain, this was only the beginning of a story far greater than anything she could have imagined. The storm outside had subsided by the time the boy was moved to a recovery ward. The penguin, meanwhile, had become an object of fascination among the hospital staff. Most couldn't resist snapping pictures or whispering in disbelief about the bird that had seemingly appeared out of nowhere, braving the blizzard to lead Emily and Martha to the child. But Emily knew there was more to this penguin than met the eye. As she sat near the boy's bed, watching his small chest rise and fall steadily, her thoughts kept returning to the bird. What had driven it to act so purposefully, so humanely? The boy, still unconscious, held no answers, his pale face serene against the pillow. It wasn't long before Emily noticed something peculiar. The penguin, which had been resting quietly in the corner, suddenly became alert. It stood, wobbling on its short legs, and made a low chirping sound. Then, to Emily's astonishment, it waddled over to the boy's bedside and gently nudged the edge of the bed frame with its beak. "Do you know him?" Emily whispered, half to herself. The bird's actions were deliberate, almost intimate, as though it recognized the child. The idea seemed absurd, but the look in the penguin's dark, intelligent eyes made her pause. Martha, who had just entered with a fresh cup of coffee, stopped in her tracks at the sight. "Is it protecting him?" she asked, her voice tinged with wonder. "I think so," Emily replied softly. "But how? And why?" The penguin settled near the boy's side, its tiny body a picture of calm determination. It stayed there, unmoving, as though standing guard over the child. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a coincidence. Hours later, as the snowplows cleared the hospital's entrance, a commotion stirred outside. A man burst through the doors, his face pale and frantic, his clothes dusted with snow. He clutched a tattered backpack and stumbled toward the front desk. "My son," he gasped. "Has anyone seen a little boy? 6 years old, brown hair, his name is Max." Emily rushed forward, her heart racing. "We found him," she said, guiding the man toward the recovery room. The moment the man entered, the penguin let out a piercing cry. It stood up, flapping its small wings as though greeting him. The man froze, his eyes widening as he took in the sight of the bird by his son's side. "Charlie," he whispered, his voice trembling. Emily blinked in confusion. "You know this penguin?" The man nodded, tears streaming down his face. "Charlie was our pet. We rescued him 2 years ago when his flock got stranded on the coastline near our home. Max adored him. They were inseparable, but Charlie disappeared during a storm last week. We thought we'd lost him forever." Emily's mind reeled. A pet? A penguin that had somehow found its way through a blizzard, miles from the coast, to save the very child who had once saved it? The story was almost too incredible to believe. As the man knelt beside his son, stroking his hair and murmuring reassurances, Emily couldn't help but marvel at the bond between the boy and the bird. It was clear now, Charlie had come looking for Max, somehow sensing that the boy was in danger. "Animals have instincts we can't even begin to understand," Martha murmured, her usual skepticism replaced with awe. Emily nodded, watching as Charlie nestled closer to the boy. "This isn't just instinct. It's love." Charlie's chirp seemed softer now, almost like a lullaby, as the boy stirred for the first time. His eyelids fluttered open, and his gaze landed on the penguin. "Charlie." Max croaked, his voice weak but filled with wonder. The bird let out an excited chirp, its tiny wings flapping wildly. Max reached out a trembling hand, and Charlie leaned into his touch, the connection between them undeniable. In the days that followed, Max recovered steadily. The story of the boy and the penguin spread like wildfire, drawing media attention and curious visitors. Everyone wanted to see the bird that had braved a storm to save its human companion. For Emily, however, the story was more than a headline. It was a reminder of the extraordinary bonds that could form between humans and animals, of the unspoken loyalty and love that transcended species. As she watched Max and Charlie together, she couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of purpose. Perhaps, she thought, the world needed more stories like this, stories of hope, resilience, and the power of unlikely saviors. The world beyond the hospital walls was abuzz with the story of Charlie the penguin and Max, the boy he had saved. News crews camped outside, eager for interviews and pictures. But within the quiet confines of Max's room, the emotional and physical challenges for the young boy and his unlikely savior were just beginning. Although the doctors assured Emily and Max's father, Tom, that he was out of immediate danger, the journey to recovery was far from over. Max was still frail, his body bearing the toll of days spent lost in the blizzard. He had moments of fever, restless dreams, and bouts of silence that worried Emily. One night, Emily found him awake, his eyes wide as he stared at the ceiling. "Max, sweetheart, are you okay?" she asked softly. "I was so scared," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I thought I'd never see Daddy again. I thought Charlie was gone forever too." Tears filled Emily's eyes as she held his hand. "But you're here now, and so is Charlie. You're both so strong." Max nodded, but the shadows of fear lingered in his gaze. The emotional weight of his ordeal was a mountain the boy would have to climb, and Emily knew it wouldn't happen overnight. While Max fought to heal, Charlie faced his own struggles. Life inside a hospital was far from his natural habitat. Though he seemed content to stay by Max's side, his health began to show signs of strain. Emily noticed it first, his feathers looked less glossy, and his movements were slower than before. "Penguins aren't meant to live like this," Martha said one afternoon as she watched Charlie shuffle around the room. "He's far from the cold waters he needs. We have to do something before it's too late." Tom nodded, his face clouded with concern. "But how can we send him back to the wild? He's been with us for so long. And after everything he's done for Max." It was a heartbreaking dilemma. Keeping Charlie close meant risking his health, but letting him go would mean breaking the bond that had saved Max's life. Despite the challenges, Max and Charlie grew closer with each passing day. Charlie seemed to sense Max's emotions, chirping softly when the boy was sad and nudging him with his beak to make him smile. One afternoon, Max asked Emily to wheel his hospital bed closer to the window. Snow still blanketed the ground, but the sun had broken through the clouds, casting a golden glow over the landscape. "Charlie, do you miss it?" Max asked, pointing to the distant horizon. The penguin tilted his head as if pondering the question. Emily watched, her heart aching. She knew Max understood more than he let on. He could see Charlie's growing fatigue, even if he didn't have the words to express it. The turning point came when Max's condition took a sudden turn. One night, his fever spiked, and the medical team rushed to stabilize him. Charlie, sensing the urgency, became agitated, pacing the room and letting out mournful cries. As Emily sat by Max's bedside, watching the boy's pale face, she made a decision. "Charlie can't stay here anymore," she said to Tom. "He's done everything he can for Max. Now it's our turn to do what's right for him." Tom nodded reluctantly. "But how do we say goodbye? Max won't understand." "It's not goodbye," Emily said firmly. "It's letting him go so he can be what he's meant to be." The next morning, Emily and Tom explained their plan to Max. They had arranged for Charlie to be taken to a wildlife sanctuary, where he could regain his strength and, eventually, return to the wild. Tears streamed down Max's face as he clung to Charlie. "But he's my best friend," he sobbed. "And you're his," Emily said gently. "That's why we have to help him, Max. Because we love him, and love means doing what's best for someone, even when it's hard." The day of Charlie's departure was bittersweet. Hospital staff, journalists, and even strangers gathered to say goodbye to the penguin who had touched so many lives. Max, too weak to leave his bed, watched from his window as Charlie was carefully placed in a transport vehicle. The boy pressed his hand to the glass, tears streaming down his cheeks. "Goodbye, Charlie," he whispered. "I'll never forget you." As if sensing the farewell, Charlie turned his head and let out a single, plaintive cry before the vehicle drove away. Weeks passed, and life began to return to normal. Max grew stronger, and his infectious laughter once again filled the hospital room. But one thing hadn't changed, his longing for Charlie. Then, one morning, Emily received a call from the wildlife sanctuary. "You're not going to believe this," the voice on the other end said. "Charlie has made an incredible recovery, and he's been spending his days swimming and thriving in our care." But what?" Emily asked, her heart skipping a beat. "He keeps waddling to the edge of the water and looking out, as if he's waiting for something, or someone." Emily's mind raced. Was Charlie still holding on to the bond he shared with Max? Could it be possible that, even in the wild, the penguin remembered the boy who had saved him just as much as he had saved Max? The emotional and physical challenges faced by Max and Charlie had forged a connection that transcended logic and distance. Both had fought their own battles, and in doing so, they had shown the world the power of resilience, love, and the profound bonds that could form between the unlikeliest of friends. The snow had long since melted, giving way to the bloom of spring. Max, now stronger and full of life, had been discharged from the hospital. Yet, a void remained in his heart. He missed Charlie terribly. Nights often found him sitting by his bedroom window, gazing at the stars and whispering, I hope you're okay out there, Charlie." Emily and Tom watched their son's quiet longing with heavy hearts. They knew Max had come a long way from the fragile, scared boy they had rescued, but part of his healing seemed inextricably tied to the penguin who had saved his life. One evening, as Max played with his toys, Emily checked the mail and froze. A thick envelope from the wildlife sanctuary had arrived. She tore it open, her hands trembling as she read the letter. "Dear Max and family. We have extraordinary news to share. Charlie, the remarkable penguin, has continued to thrive. But here's the most incredible part: each day, he waddles to the edge of the sanctuary's grounds, looking out as if waiting for someone. We believe he is longing for Max. If it's possible, we would like to arrange for Max to visit Charlie and see if this bond truly transcends the wild." Emily clutched the letter to her chest, her eyes brimming with tears. "Max," she called, her voice trembling with excitement. As she read the letter aloud, Max's face lit up with a joy she hadn't seen in months. "I get to see Charlie again?" he asked, his voice shaking with disbelief. "Yes, sweetheart," Emily replied, pulling him into a hug. "We're going to see him." The family packed their bags and made the long journey to the sanctuary. Max was practically bouncing in his seat as the car approached the sprawling reserve, a mix of excitement and nervousness coursing through him. "What if he doesn't remember me?" Max asked softly, gripping Emily's hand. Emily smiled and squeezed his hand. "Some bonds can't be forgotten, Max. Let's see what happens." As they arrived, the sanctuary staff greeted them warmly. They led the family to a quiet clearing near a crystal-clear pool, where Charlie spent most of his time. "He's over there," the guide whispered, pointing to a figure perched at the water's edge. Charlie stood with his back to them, gazing out at the horizon. Max took a tentative step forward, his heart pounding. "Charlie," he called softly. The penguin stiffened, his head tilting slightly as if he had heard something familiar. Slowly, he turned around. For a moment, everything was still. Charlie's dark eyes met Max's, and in an instant, recognition flashed across his face. Letting out an excited squawk, Charlie waddled as fast as his little legs could carry him, heading straight for Max. "Charlie!" Max cried, dropping to his knees as the penguin flung himself into the boy's arms. Tears streamed down Max's cheeks as he held his feathered friend. "I missed you so much." Emily and Tom watched from a distance, their own eyes glistening with emotion. "It's like they were never apart," Emily whispered. After the reunion, the sanctuary director approached the family. "Charlie has healed beautifully, and we believe he's ready to return to the wild. But we wanted Max to be part of this moment, to help him say goodbye." Max's face fell. "Goodbye?" Emily knelt beside him. "Max, remember what we talked about. Love means doing what's best for someone, even if it's hard. Charlie belongs in the wild, with his kind. But he'll always carry you in his heart." Max nodded, tears welling up again. "Can I be the one to let him go?" The staff agreed, and the next day, they prepared Charlie for release. The family accompanied him to the edge of the sanctuary, where the sparkling ocean awaited. Max stood by the water, holding Charlie one last time. "You saved me, Charlie," he whispered. "Now it's your turn to be free." With trembling hands, he placed Charlie on the sand. The penguin hesitated for a moment, looking back at Max as if he understood. Then, with a joyous squawk, Charlie waddled into the waves. The family watched as Charlie swam farther and farther, his sleek body gliding through the water. Just as he was about to disappear, he turned one last time, letting out a cry that echoed across the shore. "He's saying goodbye," Max said, his voice thick with emotion. Emily hugged him tightly. "And he's thanking you, Max, for loving him enough to let him go." Months passed, and life returned to its routine. Max often wondered about Charlie, imagining him exploring the vast ocean. Then, one crisp autumn morning, a package arrived from the sanctuary. Inside was a photo of Charlie, taken by a research team in Antarctica. He was standing proudly among a colony of penguins, his black and white feathers glistening in the sun. Tucked inside was a note. "Dear Max. Charlie has made it home. He's thriving, and we thought you'd like to know he's leading a group of younger penguins. It seems he's a hero to them, just like he was to you. With gratitude. The Sanctuary Team." Max clutched the photo, his heart swelling with pride and joy. "He's home," he whispered, a smile breaking across his face. Emily ruffled his hair. "And he'll always be in your heart, Max. Just like you're in his." The journey of Max and Charlie had come full circle. Their story, a testament to love, resilience, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals, would live on as a beacon of hope and inspiration for all who heard it. As the sun set over the horizon, casting a warm golden hue over the fields that stretched beyond the sanctuary, Max sat on the porch of his home, the photo of Charlie clutched tightly in his hands. It had been a year since that unforgettable reunion, and yet, some days, it felt as though the penguin had never truly left. Max often found himself wondering where Charlie was now, what adventures he was having, and if he was ever thinking of the boy who had once saved him. The gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the trees surrounding the house, bringing with it the sense of spring, fresh grass, and wildflowers. The world outside seemed to be carrying on as it always had, but for Max, everything had changed. He wasn't just a boy who had once been saved by a penguin anymore. He was someone who had learned the true meaning of love, sacrifice, and freedom, lessons he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Max had grown in ways his parents could never have predicted. The once shy, fragile child who had been filled with fear now stood tall, his shoulders squared with newfound confidence. It wasn't just the physical scars from his hospital stay that had healed. It was the emotional wounds, the ones that had plagued him for so long, that had begun to fade too. Charlie's presence in his life had been the catalyst for that transformation. Before Charlie came into his life, Max had been terrified of the unknown. He had spent so many nights lying awake, consumed by the anxiety of what might happen tomorrow, afraid of being hurt, afraid of being abandoned. But the bond he had formed with Charlie, the way the penguin had looked at him with those wide, trusting eyes, had opened Max's heart in ways he couldn't have imagined. Charlie's bravery, his resilience, and his quiet strength had taught Max that fear didn't have to define him. And most importantly, it had taught him that love, true love, meant giving freely, even when it hurt. Charlie had risked his life to save Max in that fateful storm, and Max had reciprocated that love in the only way he knew how, by letting him go. The act of freedom, of releasing the one he loved to live the life he deserved, had been the hardest thing Max had ever done, but it had also been the most selfless. And in doing so, Max had learned a valuable lesson about the nature of love. It wasn't about keeping someone close for your own happiness, it was about ensuring that they lived the fullest life possible, even if that meant letting go. As the days passed, Max found that Charlie's spirit lived on in him, not just in the memories they shared but in the way he approached life. He began to volunteer at the sanctuary, helping to care for the animals and learning more about the creatures who had once felt so distant to him. His parents, who had watched him struggle with so much uncertainty, were amazed by the maturity he had gained, the strength he had found deep within himself. Max had become the kind of person who no longer shied away from challenges, who faced each day with the quiet courage that Charlie had taught him. One afternoon, as Max walked through the sanctuary, he was approached by a new visitor, a young girl named Sophie, who was as timid and fragile as Max had once been. She had just come from a hospital stay herself, battling a chronic illness that had left her withdrawn and afraid of the world outside. Max saw something in her, a reflection of the fear he had once known, and felt a familiar pull in his heart. He knelt down beside her, offering a smile as warm as the sun shining above them. "Would you like to meet Charlie's family?" Max asked, his voice gentle, but full of the wisdom he had gained. Sophie looked up at him, her eyes filled with curiosity. "Charlie has a family?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Max nodded. "Yes, he does. And we can go visit them together, if you'd like." As they walked through the sanctuary, Max shared the story of how Charlie had come into his life, of how the penguin had been a hero in the truest sense. Sophie listened intently, her eyes wide with wonder, and for the first time in a long while, she smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that made Max's heart swell. In that moment, Max realized that the bond he had with Charlie was not just a chapter in his own story. It was a story that could be passed on, one that could inspire others, just as it had inspired him. He had been given the gift of love and healing, and now he had the power to pass that gift on to others, to help them see that no matter how broken or lost they felt, there was always hope, always a way forward. The years moved on, and Max grew older, entering high school, exploring new passions, and continuing to volunteer at the sanctuary. Though he had made many new friends and forged many new connections, there was always a part of him that would forever belong to Charlie, the penguin who had shown him the depths of courage and the true meaning of love. One evening, as Max sat by the window, looking up at the stars once more, he thought of Charlie. He thought of the day they had said their final goodbye and how, despite the pain of the separation, he had felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Charlie had been free. And so, too, had Max. "Wherever you are, I hope you're happy," Max whispered into the quiet night. "And I'll never forget you." Just then, a soft squawk echoed in the distance, faint but unmistakable. Max smiled, his heart full of warmth. He didn't know if it was just the wind playing tricks or if, somehow, Charlie was out there, still watching over him. Either way, he knew the lesson would stay with him forever. Love, when given freely, has the power to heal, to transcend time, and to connect us in ways that words could never fully express. Max closed his eyes, his hand pressed over his heart, and for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace.